I'm Chris Schlag. I am counsel with Nixon Peabody. I'm also on the board of directors, and I'm going to be joining you all today to talk about some developments in the EPA space. I really want to just spend some time with you all on talking about regulatory developments and changing landscapes. But before we delve into that, so you know a little bit about me, I have a background in environmental engineering and sustainability management. So I've been in this space since about 2002. I started out in engineering and sustainability management, kind of on the technical side. And then because I'm a glutton for punishment, I decided to go to law school, and I have focused my legal career in those areas ever since. I have in-house experience with Whole Foods Market and Tyson Foods. So a lot of the work I do right now is environmental risk management and sustainability in the food, bev, and ag space. But I'm also product and value chain focused. So I work with a lot of manufacturers and also a lot of different industry folks on how they're navigating current landscapes, how they're dealing with sustainability issues for their business and their brands, also potentially their products, and then how they're dealing with stakeholder relationships. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through some changing landscapes with you, discuss some policy shifts that we've seen since the Trump administration has come in. We'll talk about some regulatory developments. I will give you all some predictions that I have about what some of these changes might mean for the environmental landscape. And then we'll talk about some business considerations for some of these developments, including specifically how New Hampshire businesses should be thinking and reacting to some of these developments. And then we'll open it up for questions, and I hope you all will have questions and things for us to talk about, because I did leave quite a bit of time for that. So to kick us off, I just want to kind of set the stage with businesses have a lot of environmental risk and opportunities really just outside of the regulatory landscape. So if you're in the manufacturer context, or if you're selling or distributing anything, you always have this underlying product stewardship expectation from your overarching stakeholders, and that can be your consumers or your customers. And just generally, how are you managing your stewardship responsibilities as a company? There's also regulatory compliance considerations. So this can be everything from how are you labeling your products? What warnings do you have with your products? How are you selling products, if you are actually selling products? If you are sourcing materials, where those materials come from? Have you done a risk assessment to determine what impacts the sourcing of those materials has? Do you have supply chain due diligence programs in place? How are you sharing that information with your customers? So there's a lot to think about in the regulatory context and the product stewardship context. But then more than that, as we globalize, as companies have broader reaches, or as they develop and maybe shift across borders, there's also increasing risk to navigate. Some of those risk mitigation strategies involve where you are selling your products, what specific method of selling your products you might use, or where your customers are coming from and understanding their stakeholder expectations. Just as an example, and because I worked at Whole Foods, I can give you the kind of the illustration of if you are manufacturing or placing products with a company that has a specific brand reputation around sustainability or social responsibility, there can be expectations from that customer around how you're structuring your own internal programs, how you're navigating risk, and then what your specific compliance goals or outcomes look like. This can look like an ethics and compliance program requirement. It can look like a supplier code of conduct expectation. Customers can also require audits or verifications, and that's something that we're seeing increasingly. And while those things initially started looking at how are you navigating social responsibility, over time, they've begun to incorporate environmental risk and environmental opportunities. So there's some components there as well. And then just from an overall brand reputation and kind of incident management standpoint, environmental impacts can lead to a really big perception of how a company is doing. And this can be both from like, what's your relationship with the community? What's your relationship with your neighbors? To what is your relationship with a specific state or federal agencies? And do you have that good working relationship, or are you embroiled in some type of enforcement? But then more than that, it can result in litigation and brand reputation harm if you do have a negative environmental outcome based off of your own activities or operations. So there's a lot to think about, and regulatory compliance in the environmental context is really just that very tiny small bit. And I want you all to be thinking about the big picture as we're talking about current landscapes and regulatory policies. So just shifting gears from all of that, we're going to jump into a discussion of changing legal landscapes, changing regulatory landscapes. I'm not going to go into a huge deep dive on all of these items, but I will touch on them so that you understand kind of where things are going, what we might see in the future. So just to kick things off, since the Trump administration came on board, there's been a heavy focus on deregulation and creating an environment that supports energy development. So pretty much since the Trump administration was, onboarded and active and able to start issuing policy, there were a number of executive orders issued by the White House that said they were going to be reviewing and potentially sunsetting environmental laws and regulations, and then eliminating 10 regulations for each new regulation that gets issued. So I want to take a step back and just understand what a deregulation initiative means. So from a legal standpoint, to deregulate, you do actually have to go through a regulatory process. So it's one thing to issue an executive order that says that these are the policies and these are the stances that the administration is going to take. It's another thing to actually go through and deregulate in that context. So for EPA to withdraw or eliminate 10 regulations, they do actually have to go through rulemaking, and that process consists of them giving a proposal of, this is specifically what we would like to change. Here's our process for how we're going to change it. And then they have to go through a commenting process where the public's able to comment on what that actually looks like. This takes an extensive period of time. Sometimes the rulemaking process for a proposed regulation or a regulation that's being withdrawn can take years, and that can be extended if there's any type of litigation over that regulation. So while the Trump administration does have this clear agenda in mind, some of the things that they're wanting to do are not immediate. And that's really important for the business community to understand, because it means that there's compliance obligations and there's environmental requirements that apply to businesses now that haven't changed and aren't going to change anytime soon. And the developments need to be looked at very carefully before you understand what your compliance obligations are. The other thing to note is that while the Trump administration is focusing regulatory development in the context of supporting energy development, so the regulations that they're looking at doing and the things that they're looking at withdrawing, they're trying to promote domestic energy production, oil and gas development, coal development. They're wanting to change some of the restrictions on certain types of activities. The overall sort of plan and regulatory processes here, there's a number of different agencies involved. So EPA is just one to focus on, but it doesn't change the overall considerations for environmental risk and opportunities. So how I said in the beginning slide of the regulatory compliance considerations are just one facet of these business opportunities, these business considerations. This America First Energy Plan and the development of energy resources, they also have to take into account the other landscape that goes along with it. So while we might have a more regulatory friendly approach for energy production and oil and gas development, that doesn't change other competing stakeholder risks that might be there for businesses in that space. So businesses still need to navigate the fact that we have federal environmental laws, including the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and a number of others, which really protect our natural resources and really require that companies are maintaining industry standards and also doing their best for the environment. Because if they have a negative environmental effect or outcome as a result of their activities, they can be held liable under the federal laws, whether EPA is regulating in that context or not. In fact, under most federal laws that are dealing with environmental resource issues, there's a private right of action, which allows citizens to bring a lawsuit to either enforce the requirement that's in the federal statute or to pursue damages from a violation that the company has had. So while the Trump administration is deregulating in the context of promoting these types of activities, we're starting to see nonprofit groups and organizations really get into a focus point of seeing, are these activities resulting in environmental harm? And if so, is there an avenue to bring a citizen lawsuit against them, either because EPA is no longer actually enforcing some of the federal statutes, or because there's now an avenue to enforce because there's some environmental harm that was caused that the regulatory component's no longer correcting. So while the changing landscape does lead to a specific regulatory policy, there are still those ongoing risks for businesses, particularly in this space, if EPA is not actually regulating the way that they should. The Trump administration has also very clearly, from executive orders, from its regulatory agenda, from its most recently announced unified agenda. And if you all are interested in this, I'd be happy to share it. But the Trump administration did actually release its unified regulatory agenda, which shares all of the different rulemaking activities that the agencies are going to be involved in and sets the prioritization of these agencies over the upcoming calendar year. The Trump administration very clearly wants to minimize certain science-based policies and also certain climate-based policies. So there's been an attack on, and I'll call it an attack because it's definitely a focused sort of removal of any regulatory policies or frameworks that really promote acting on climate issues. So there's been a withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. There's a specific look at any Biden era policies that really looked at GHG emissions or advancing clean energy. All of the environmental justice initiatives for all of the different agencies have been really looked at, and some of them have been dropped. And then there's also a focus on eliminating those regulations that really treat climate risk or climate action as the desirable goalpost. That does not mean that there's been an elimination of all sort of GHG emission requirements or that all climate-related policies have been eliminated. It just means that this administration clearly is not advancing a policy tied to climate action. And they're trying to remove some of the policies and some of the findings that were in place that allowed federal agencies to regulate on the basis that climate change was a direct threat to humanity and required regulation. So there's some developments going on right now. EPA has proposed a withdrawal of its endangerment finding for climate change. This proposal is currently in a commenting phase, and I have to tell you that it's received some of the most amount of comments that any federal agency action has received. It is not even a closed comment period yet, and they've already had over 70,000 comments filed, some of them by businesses, some of them by just interested parties that really want to understand what is the basis for this change in decision making. And so that's something to closely watch. That's also an area where there are nonprofits and NGOs that are really ready to sue EPA for removing that endangerment finding. Kind of going hand in hand with that proposal to change the endangerment finding, EPA is also proposing to eliminate some of its GHG emissions programs. This would mean that businesses no longer have a mandatory obligation in certain context to report GHG emissions. But this wouldn't change the context where businesses have to report or disclose their GHG emissions from a sustainability standpoint. So if businesses have stakeholders that are really interested in those climate risk or climate opportunities, or are interested in their GHG emissions, then that really wouldn't change the expectations for them. The other thing that I'll say about this is that in the absence of some of these policies and regulations on EPA's side, it just creates an opportunity for states to step in and provide more clarification or more guidance and direction to businesses. We've also not seen businesses reacting in the same way. So while you might have an EPA that's saying climate change is not something we need to be worried about, and we do not need to regulate in this context, we're seeing insurance companies, financial firms, and others say that's not the case. They understand very clearly that the science points to climate change is real, that there are climate risks that are facing certain industries. And so it can be a disadvantage to businesses to no longer manage climate risk or to not manage GHG emission reporting, because that's something that they might need to get favorable insurance policies or rates, or even to get into investment opportunities. So just something to think about. The other thing I'd note is the Trump administration has said very vocally that they're going to take a business-friendly enforcement approach with respect to environmental regulations. But this isn't always the case. So while this is something that has been said, what we've seen kind of in the legal sphere is that EPA is actually being quite aggressive with certain types of environmental regulations. So they're very focused on product environmental issues in the context of pesticides, hazardous materials management. They're coming in very strong with enforcement initially, and they're not always being open to some sort of rationalization of a settlement. And so there's a number of cases where a prior administration, we might have been able to very quickly close the door or end that enforcement in a way that didn't have big penalties for the business. But in some cases, now we're seeing them take a very aggressive posture so that they can get higher penalties. Some of this is driven by the fact that EPA doesn't have the budget and doesn't have the organizational structure that it had in prior administrations. And so they have to recoup funding for some of their programs as a result of that, and enforcement is one way to do that. The other thing is, while they are taking a business-friendly enforcement approach for oil and gas, as the whole strategy of the Trump administration has been to kind of promote domestic energy production, that allows them to shift enforcement to other industries. So industries that maybe haven't been the focus of enforcement before are really the focus of enforcement now, and that includes consumer product goods companies, retailers, and then some smaller sort of food-based companies or companies that have ammonia refrigeration or refrigeration systems where they can really get in and look at their chemical management. EPA has also been pretty aggressive on identifying Superfund sites and Superfund liability. So they're looking for those industrial sites where there needs to be some cleanup, and they're not being very business-friendly in that context. So kind of shifting from what's happening from a Trump administration lane to what's happening in the sustainability context, I do want to say this is a very important area to watch for businesses, particularly if they're wanting to grow or move across borders or are planning to be more of a global business. And it's a fast evolving landscape. So some of you may have heard or maybe recall that in 2023, SEC had proposed climate rules. This would have required public companies that met certain thresholds to actually be disclosing their GHG emissions and their climate risk and climate opportunities This whole rulemaking has gone through one of the, if you're a legal nerd like me, you will appreciate it as a very fascinating and very interesting administrative law process. If you're not, I apologize in advance for maybe going into too much detail here, but SEC did this fascinating thing where they finalized the rule in 2025, or I'm sorry, in 2024. And as soon as they finalized the rule, and it had been in rulemaking for 3 years, they faced litigation. They had almost 8 litigants bring actions against them, and that got consolidated in the 8th Circuit of Appeals. That happened during the Biden era. And there was a changeover between the Biden era and the current Trump administration while that litigation has been pending. Since there's litigation on the rule, SEC voluntarily stayed it. So it's never been enforced, it's never been implemented, but it is still there, and SEC has not gone through rulemaking to withdraw the rule. This is really important because the Biden administration put on a very, very heartfelt defense of their final rule, said it was valid. They presented a ton of documentation and effort to show that there was legal grounds for them to have issued the rule. And SEC has not changed position on that in a court context. They did change that position publicly, but they've not, like I said, gone through any rulemaking or any efforts to change that rule from a regulatory standpoint. So in the litigation, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, they're going to issue a ruling, which could basically say, hey, we find that SEC did have grounds to issue this regulation. And as a result of that, SEC can finalize it and should enforce it or should withdraw it. But in that amount of time, SEC actually came back and said that they're not planning to participate in the court action anymore. But so they'll take whatever direction the court provides. That's very unusual for a federal agency to withdraw from the defense of one of their regulations. And it's also very unusual that the court would have to ask them what they would be doing if they plan to enforce it or if they plan to withdraw it in the future in order for the court to make a decision. So we'll have to see what the court actually does. But if the court does send it back and finds that it is a valid law, then there's a possibility that SEC could be required to enforce it as is, which means that companies may have a climate rule reporting obligation, or SEC might have to actually go through some type of process to remove this rule and kind of adjust it in the future. So it's a really interesting area. It is something to keep an eye on. In the interim, even if you don't have a climate rule, there is a really, really rich case law of what is required to be disclosed to investors and stakeholders and what type of information needs to be shared with them. And there's this idea of materiality. So if it is something that could financially, materially impact your company, and it would be meaningful to an investor to know that information, then you do have an obligation to disclose it under federal law. So whether or not there's a climate rule, if your company has knowledge of some type of climate risk or opportunity, and that's a material issue for your company, there's a whole body of law that says that there's some disclosure expectations. And so it will be interesting to see over time how that gets fleshed out and what that means in the climate context, but we are expecting there to be litigation about it in the future. In the interim, states are moving ahead with their own sort of regulatory frameworks, regulatory requirements, and policies. So California is kind of taking the lead here in that they have enacted 2 climate disclosure laws. Both of them are taking effect in January 1, 2026. These laws have really broad extraterritorial reach. And what I mean by that is if you're doing business in California and you hit some of their revenue thresholds, then there's an obligation to comply with them, whether or not you are actually based in California. And that is because the laws apply to doing business in California. So what I mean by doing business, if you own property in California, if you have employees in California, if you are selling products into California or reach a certain sales amount, it's entirely possible that you might fall into this doing business in California definition. And then these laws would apply to you if you hit the revenue thresholds. So the first one is a disclosure law. It's 261. This law requires that you are actually disclosing climate risk to the extent that you know about them. The disclosure risks need to be disclosed in a report that is on a public-facing website and then reported to the California Air Resources Board. The second law is a GHG emission reporting law. This is SB 253. This one applies to companies that are in doing business in California that have over 1 billion in revenue. So there's a bigger threshold for revenue amounts. And this just requires that you're doing GHG emission reporting. There's still some unknowns with these laws, despite the fact that they're going into effect January 1, 2026. And the reason for that is the California Air Resources Board is going through rulemaking to implement them. But we're expecting those regulations to come out kind of by the end of the year. And those regulations are really going to set the tone for an industry standard, industry expectation for required GHG emission reporting and climate risk disclosures in the United States. We've also already seen other states start to follow suit. So New York is advancing similar legislation. They're expected to kind of move that forward towards the end of this year, beginning of next year. So you might see more states have this in the future. And in either case, even if you are not in a state that has one of these mandatory frameworks, if you have a customer that is subject to one of these requirements, whether it's the climate risk reporting or it's the GHG emission reporting, oftentimes these companies have to implement supply chain programs where they're getting climate risk information and GHG emission data from their suppliers to be able to meet their own reporting obligations. So there's kind of a full value chain impact here for those companies that are going to be regulated. And we expect to see more states move ahead with similar sort of legislation in the future. The other thing is that there's a fast evolving landscape in the litigation context, and some of the disclosures, some of the reporting actually opens up the door for more litigation. So there's an intense focus on greenwashing. What companies say versus what they do can give this indication of greenwashing. In other words, there's some discrepancy between what your purported commitments are and what your actual actions are as a company. And this is something that I would say the plaintiff's bar can pick up pretty closely from what's been disclosed about your products or what's been disclosed about your climate risk and opportunities versus what's actually happening with your products. And that will be an easier area for them to pick at in the future when there's mandatory sustainability reporting obligations that are public facing. We're also seeing a lot of challenges to labeling. So there's an intense scrutiny right now of labeling of food products, and particularly meat and poultry items and also dairy products that have any type of environmental related claims. And these can be things from recyclable to environmentally friendly to any reference of climate. And there's a big focus by certain NGOs and groups on saying that these claims really create confusion in the consumer context because they're misrepresenting the overall impact of either the product or the company. And the list litigation is just expected to increase, especially if we have federal agencies that are not actively managing these requirements, or if there's no longer a consistent regulatory framework for what companies need to do to ensure that their labels are not misleading or confusing consumers. Moving us a little bit along. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard about extended producer responsibility, but this is a growing thing in the environmental context. I sometimes talk about extended producer responsibility all day, every day. It is, if you do not know about it, it is an expectation that it's placed on either the manufacturers, the brand owners, or licensees for packaging materials or food serviceware that is used for their products. And this is a growing state trend. So I'm just going to click through to this next chart here. This is an effort by states to make sure that packaging materials, food service ware, anything that is potentially made of plastic or paperboard or cardboard, materials that should be recyclable, are actually being managed in the most sustainable way. The idea is that from a waste management perspective, states are having to increasingly manage single-use plastic items, different types of corrugate, from shipping of materials, specifically consumer product goods, and also from management of waste from consumer product goods. So far, there's 11 states that have moved forward with extended producer responsibility laws. New Hampshire is not one of them, though New Hampshire is surrounded by states that have moved forward with them. Maine, for example, is moving forward with an EPR framework. And what this will do is if you are a producer of packaging materials, you must collect data on that material, report it to the state either individually or through a producer responsibility organization, and then pay a required fee. There can be a pretty big impact to companies that are subject to these requirements. So Oregon, for example, is the state that's program has moved along the furthest at this point in time. If you're a producer that's subject to Oregon's EPR requirements, they have already been rolling out fees. And I have some clients that have told me the cost for packaging is at around 40 to 50% more with the EPR fees that are being assessed for the packaging. The other thing is that because of the way these programs are structured, they're not always resulting in the most sustainable outcome for the packaging material, because they're really just looking at fee management and fee assessment for the packaging materials. And so we're seeing some disincentives for certain more sustainable packaging options. And I'll just give you an example. Under some of these EPR frameworks, the cost for a plastic material that is recyclable from an EPR fee standpoint is actually is actually higher than for a polystyrene foam. So some packaging suppliers have shifted back to using a polystyrene foam instead of a recyclable plastic material, because that reduces their overall EPR fees. We've also seen that the focus on EPR programs has had the unintended consequence of disincentivizing retailer take-back programs in some contexts. So there are some retailers that have had really effective stewardship take-back programs with recyclers for some consumer products. And because of the way these EPR programs are functioning, it just changes that expectation, and you now have duplicate costs for the same material. So there's been some rethinking of how those take-back programs look. There is a patchwork of legislation here because we do not have a federal law that governs packaging material waste. The reason for that is the EPA does not have jurisdiction over non-hazardous materials that become waste. So solid waste management is left up to the states. So not only do we have 50 different states with 50 different solid waste management laws, we now have all of these different managements for packaging materials. So this is something to keep an eye on. And if you have consumer products and you're shipping them across the United States, you do want to be aware that you could be a producer, and be double checking to make sure that you're managing those responsibilities. Another big item where states are starting to focus is on PFAS. EPA has had some changes in its policies around PFAS recently. They just changed how they're wanting to regulate certain PFAS substances from a drinking water standpoint. They're also thinking through how they're going to assess PFAS in the context of toxicity and whether it's going to be considered a toxic substance under federal environmental law. Sort of in the absence of this federal regulation, we've seen states really move forward with their own PFAS expectations. So this includes maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. It includes requirements to assess PFAS in the context of wastewater, especially if you have wastewater treatment systems. If you're manufacturing food products, it could mean that you have to do some assessment on your systems to make sure you don't have any sort of introduction of PFAS in the context of your manufacturing operations. But then on top of that, we've seen states start to impose no intentionally added requirements. So this is an expectation that if you're manufacturing any type of product that's going to be a consumer product, or any type of product where there's a potential exposure to consumers to PFAS, then you are either banned from using that PFAS material intentionally, or you need to have some type of supply chain controls to make sure it's not intentionally added. There's over 10,000 different types of PFAS related substances that are out there, and some of them have varying toxicities. And so the example I will give you is Teflon, or PTFE. This is actually under the PFAS umbrella because it has a sort of fluorine carbon bond that we need to be considering, but it does not have the same type of hazards as other type of PFAS substances. And so you could be using PTFE in your products, or you could have a supplier that is using PTFE in their products and not have any type of exposure issue or any type of risk. But because of how the PFAS laws are developing, you might need to do some supply chain due diligence or disclosures, or have some controls in your manufacturing operations to make sure that you're telling upstream sort of customers and consumers about that potential exposure risk. So this is another hot area to watch. If you're in certain types of industries, including textiles or food products or manufacturing, this is also an area where there's some litigation risk. And so you may want to be just double checking what your PFAS exposure is like. All right, so I'm going to shift gears for us a little bit and talk about some regulatory predictions. Please take these with a grain of salt. These are my predictions, but the landscape is very fast moving, and sometimes it does not actually play out the way that we guess. But deregulation activities, I mentioned this earlier, this does not change all regulatory requirements for businesses. And the fact that we have an administration saying that there's a business-friendly approach to enforcement does not necessarily mean that this is a business-friendly approach for all industries, or on all issues. And state-specific legislation, regulation, and enforcement can have a very big impact, even if it's a state where you do not have physical operations. So New Hampshire businesses, if they have products or customers or stakeholders in other states, should be aware of the patchwork of state legislation that's out there that could be relevant to their products. And then because we have an absence of federal activity in some instances, this just creates an avenue for state action. And so we've already seen kind of a hotbed of state regulatory activity, state legislation trends, specifically around extended producer responsibility, management of packaging materials, and sort of packaging waste. And that means that if you're growing or becoming a bigger sort of business that has a bigger footprint across the United States, you might need to account for more state variations in your compliance programs and really structure it to make sure you're accounting for those state differences. There's an increased potential for civil action and liability for environmental impact. I mentioned previously that because EPA is the primary enforcer of environmental laws, if EPA is choosing not to regulate or choosing not to enforce those environmental laws, it does create an avenue under federal environmental law frameworks for private citizens to bring those actions. And we've already started to see citizen suits pick up on against companies where there's a perceived environmental damage because of the company's inaction or failure to meet expected standards of care. And then there's an ongoing and prevalent potential for stakeholder boycotts or brand boycotts, shareholder resolutions for some companies, and there can be media scrutiny and investigations depending on what the environmental issues are, just as a way to really highlight this discrepancy from what's happening in our communities, in our areas versus what's happening with federal EPA. And so we've already seen some companies get a lot of scrutiny for what may have been a minor issue and not picked up on previously, because EPA was handling it and it just wasn't that big of a deal. But now it's really a way for the media or somebody to make a big deal of, hey, this company is a bad actor because this environmental issue happened and EPA didn't address it. And so there's some political risk that goes along with environmental issues now, just based off of how EPA is behaving. And then we are already starting to see insurance companies and mortgage brokers really think through how they're pricing certain businesses or loans or investments or insurance policies based off of climate risk, environmental risk, and how companies are managing them. So whether or not the regulatory landscape actually requires you to be navigating certain environmental issues in a certain way, it does not mean that from a business perspective, you are actually going to be able to do it that way. There might be an ongoing expectation from stakeholders or from insurance companies or even from mortgage brokers that you do have certain programs in place, certain stewardship initiatives to manage these environmental risks and make sure that you are being a good steward of both your business and any environmental footprint that's under your control. We're expecting and are already seeing a lot of litigation on environmental issues, but also on sustainability issues as well. So in the greenwashing context, I mentioned that NGOs and activists are really looking at companies' disclosures and their reporting, including how those things may have changed between 2024 and 2025, or between 2023 and 2025. While a lot of the focus has been on shifting language for social responsibility and DEI, there has also been a really big close attention to how companies are talking about environmental risk and environmental opportunities. The example I'll give you is around net zero. So if you have net zero claims or emissions reductions goals, there has been a scrutiny by litigants on whether those are actually truthful or if they can be misleading to consumers. They've also come up in the context of, have you misled potential investors or stakeholders if you've been talking about any type of emissions reductions expectations. So we're watching for an increase in greenwashing claims. We're also expecting a potential for coercion or antitrust violations in certain securities contexts as we start to see just increased scrutiny on ESG related statements and whether they're material or not. We've also seen some creative arguments about folks colluding over certain types of initiatives in the sustainability and DEI space. And so that's something to watch as well. And then the traditional private rights of action that I mentioned previously of citizen suits. And we've also seen some development of litigants bringing actions over a failure to respect or acknowledge environmental justice considerations specific to the permit context. So that's a lot of information. You all will get my slide deck at the end of today, but I know we've got about 15 minutes and I did want to open it up for questions. So I'm just going to stop share and see if my crew has had any questions pop up for us.
So we do have a question in the chat for you, Chris, and I know that it has been an issue for New Hampshire as well, most recently with legislation targeting the insurance and financial industries and their use of ESG measures to evaluate performance. So the question from Karen is, are there any state level anti-ESG laws being litigated?
Yes, there are. So I will just say in the ESG context, and ESG is a broad term, but so in the ESG context, there are state laws that advance ESG, and then there's some that really detract from it. And a good example I can give you is actually Texas. Texas has a whole body of anti-ESG laws that have been really used to restrict decision-making around ESG. Certain funds cannot use ESG in their decision-making. public agencies in Texas cannot, make decisions on ESG principles unless they have an independent basis to do so. And that those laws are being reconsidered and actively litigated because there's been some studies to show that the anti-ESG efforts in Texas have actually cost the state a ton of money. And so they're not in the best interest of Texas. And I bring that up to say that, like, probably the most anti-ESG positions are being heavily litigated and challenged there because you can see the economic impact of it. There's actually also active litigation on pro ESG laws, including California's climate disclosure bills, which we talked about. And that litigation is allowing the laws to proceed. But there's still active litigation over whether it should be, confined to just entities that are operating in California where their business is based, or whether it's allowed to have this extraterritorial reach or require public disclosure. Because it's one thing to say you have to report something to an agency. It's entirely different to say you have to disclose it and disclose it in this context. And that's almost a forced speech issue. And that's the argument that's being made, is that it's a First Amendment violation. So I would say lots of state level ESG litigation is happening. And I'd be happy to share more details. If there's an interest, please feel free to just email me or reach out.
Great. And I want to encourage everyone, whether you want to use the Q&A or the chat, if you have questions about how all of this is affecting your business, those are questions that I'm sure Chris is happy to address as well. But I'm also wondering, just looking at the changes in GHG reporting, like, are you seeing most companies still actively pursuing and continuing with kind of the programs that they have set up in anticipation of, the SEC reporting requirements, or has there been a big shift?
Yeah, so I would say that most of the companies that were doing ESG reporting, ESG disclosures, or climate related reporting and disclosures before the Trump administration are still doing them. So there's not been a change in business level activity. Some of that is because the companies were large enough that the stakeholder expectations exist, whether or not the Trump administration has, a regulatory policy or is advancing regulation on that point. And I'll just give you an example. If you operate globally, meaning you put products in Europe or Australia or even Brazil, or if you have entities in any of those locations, then you're probably subject to sustainability reporting requirements in those countries. Europe has the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and a Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive. And both of those things require that you are disclosing and reporting on information, that you have supply chain level developments to make sure you're passing GHG emission data kind of across the board so that consumers can share or will access information and understand the climate impact of the products that they're getting. And also so that investors can make good decisions there. And so what we've seen is that global companies, to navigate their global requirements, are almost not caring what is happening from a federal EPA standpoint because they have these other stakeholder expectations. Apologies, I think it's ragweed that's getting to me today. But what we're also seeing is that because most of the companies in the US have some touch points with these larger global companies, either because they're their consumers or they're companies that they do business with, there's a supply chain expectation or a customer expectation that's rolling down. So we have companies that have decided, hey, I'm not subject to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, but my customer is. And so I need to do the reporting and disclosure to be able to do that. So a lot of folks are continuing to do that just simply because of the supply chain expectations.
Mm. Well, I'm glad to hear that there's still the ability to, on all of the rules and regulations for individuals to kind of step forward and find a way to push compliance with these rules forward. But in any case, it's it's been a challenging time, obviously, for people to understand what is and isn't important. But I'm imagining with the group of attendees that we have, it's more a practice that they have had in place for a very long time and will continue regardless.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sorry, my ragweed situation has not improved. But I'll just say I think it should for folks, I think they should feel confident that anything they're doing from an environmental stewardship or a sustainability standpoint, um, even if it's not regulatorily required, is a good thing, and will help them manage their legal risk long term. We also find that businesses that are addressing social responsibility and sustainability are actually better positioned for resiliency. So they're doing better with risk management, they're doing better from product development, cost management, stakeholder relationships. And so all of these things are really beneficial. And that regulatory component is just one component of your overarching business operations. And so layering everything else on, these can really put you ahead of the curve competition wise, especially if we have an administration change in a couple of years and have a big pendulum swing back in terms of policy.
Not if, we will, right? He
Well,
has his
I'm a
second
lawyer,
term
so I have to
already.
say if, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we have another question from Karen. She is asking, are there any proposed SEC changes regarding ability to file shareholder proposals, especially those addressing environmental issues?
Yes, there was actually a proposed rule and a final rule that did come forward on, and also a change in shareholder policies that really looked at how shareholders were engaging on ESG issues. It didn't get to the root of the proposal component, but it did address how they were engaging and what administratively they had to do if they were reaching out to a company about ESG. And specifically, now, if you are engaging purely about an ESG issue or not necessarily to get the company's opinion about what specifically they're doing and more interested in saying, we want you to do X because we think that you should be doing it, which is what a lot of shareholder proposals are in the ESG space. There's now a lot of filings and a lot of additional things that they have to do. And so we've actually seen ESG proposals drop because of that, because it's a pretty big burden on the shareholder to be able to do that type of engagement or the proposal in the future. I will also say there's been some litigation on shareholder proposals on ESG issues. Exxon specifically brought a lawsuit against a shareholder who'd made a proposal in the ESG context. And it was a really aggressive move. It's unusual for a company to sue a shareholder, but the reason that they did is they said that the proposal was not structured or approached in a way that was focused on advancing the material interest of the company or even for an appropriate purpose. It was more to just address this like ESG issue or consideration. And that litigation like ongoing. I think some of it was settled outside of court in a confidential way in which we're not going to get a ton of information. But it did go through several rounds of litigation. And I think it's important to know that like there's a difference between an ESG proposal where someone says, hey, we care about this issue and we'd like you to address it, and a proposal that's actually actively threatening the company or trying to do something that's a bit nefarious. And some of those ESG proposals in the past couple of years broached that line of activism and not a like purely advancing business interest purpose. And so it did open them up to some scrutiny from a litigation standpoint. So so there's developments there, but I will say I have just seen ESG proposals drop off primarily because of this new expectation that if you're filing them or you're filing a resolution, that you have to have it tied to this business purpose and you have to go through these extra filings.
Mm. Lots of extra hurdles.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Well, Chris, thank you so much. I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to share.
Yeah, the only thing I would just say is that I think being in New Hampshire, there's a lot going on around us in terms of sustainability, packaging, environmental law developments, and in knowing what federal EPA is doing is just one piece of it. Also need to have an understanding of what our state agencies are doing. And then just where our products and everything we're doing is going, because we're surrounded and probably doing business in other states where knowing their policies can be helpful. So
Yes. For too long, we have been the donut hole in New England, so
yeah.
we'll keep working on that. But I just want to thank you for spending or sharing your insights, Chris. It has been amazing, and we're very happy to let you all know that Chris is a member of the NHBSR Board of Directors. I don't know if she mentioned that, so you can expect to hear from her more often. We're lucky to have someone who aligns so well with our mission and vision, so we're thrilled to have her. If you have any ideas for further things that you'd like to hear Chris talk about, please share them with us. But in the meantime, I also want to mention that we have our Climate Action Challenge that Debbie has ported over to an online learning platform. As NHBSR members, all of your employees have access to that. So it's a way for you to help climate teams kind of get up and running. We invite you to participate in that. And then we also invite you to join and meet Chris in person at our 25th celebration on November 6th. So I hope to see you all there. And again, our thanks, Chris, for
Yeah, thank
sharing
you.
your all of your wonderful insights.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I hope to see you all at the event in November and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.